Good evening, everyone, and very warm welcome on a rather cold day to this evening's event, marking the publication of a special feature of the London Review of Education, which in turn marks the 120th anniversary of the founding of the IOE. I'm Professor Li Wei. I'm Director and Dean of the IOE and Chair of the Board of the journal, and also your chair this evening. Just some very quick housekeeping matters. If you do hear a fire alarm, please take the doors there on my left behind me. And I think some of the other doors can be used too. For those on social media, the Twitter hashtag is IOE120. People watching online can post questions for the Q&A session via Slido. Now, as an IOE director, I was very keen that we celebrate the faculty's 120th anniversary and recognize our key figures and ideas from our history. The London Review of Education, as IOE's flagship journal, was the perfect vehicle for that. And I was very pleased to co-edit the special issue on IOE at 120. Now, I say co-editing, that's a bit of an exaggeration on my behalf because my contributions were rather marginal and nominal. I must thank Professor Hugh Starkey for driving the project forward, who did all the editing and everything else for the special feature. We'll be hearing from Hugh in a minute. Hugh and I are incredibly proud of the issue and grateful to our contributors and reviewers, and of course the UCL press team. Of necessity, the issue can only reflect a small selection of IOE people, research and teaching. But the contributions from within and beyond the IOE capture very well its DNA and its enduring influence. Some of the articles focus on individuals, some are strands of activities. All of them unite under the banner of IOE's mission to further equity and social justice through education. Now, for this evening's event, we have chosen to focus on IOE's work on education and international development as a case study, if you will, of the profound reimagining that has taken place and continues to take place at IOE. I very much look forward to discussing that aspect of IOE's past, present, and future with you. Before we hear from other speakers, let me invite London Review of Education's editor-in-chief and the co-editor of this special issue, Professor Hugh Starkey, to say a few words.
Thank you, Li Wei, and your contribution was essential in giving the special feature the prestige that it needed to encourage people to contribute. My role is to introduce this special feature. I'm delighted to see a number of authors of papers here. We called it Critical Engagement with Educational and Social Thought, Practice and Development. And I've divided the papers perhaps rather arbitrarily into different topics. The first one being early years. And so there are 5 papers that could come under this theme. The first by Sandy Leeton-Gray, who is here, talks about Susan Isaacs. And Sandy was just reminding me that as she was doing the archival research for this, she found down the back of a sofa in the library a huge treasure chest that could possibly be used for some scholarships, she thinks, or anyway, there is something definitely to go further with. The second paper in this series is about Thomas Coram. We have Peter Moss here, also co-authored with Julia Brannan and Charlie Owen and Anne Phoenix. They reflect on the life and times of their research unit. Rosemary Davis, who's also here, has written about her experience of being the founder of the PGCE primary at a time when it wasn't thought that primary teachers needed a university education. They could just go into the classroom. And Rosemary pioneered that and has written about it very interestingly. And drawing on IOE's collaborative traditions, Linang with Shinad Hemi and Julian Grenier talk about a participatory approach to supporting early language and communication in a London nursery school. And finally, Priscilla Alderson, who is herself a contributor a frequent contributor to London Review of Education and an outstanding expert on early years education, writes about Berry Mayall and Roy Basker, both recently departed, but both hugely important critical thinkers. The next group of papers I've called Pioneers, and Gary McCulloch, who's here, wrote about Fred Clark, whose name you will recognise as one of the rooms in IOE. John and Priscilla White themselves, outstanding philosophers of education, write about Richard Peters and his legacy. Martin Hammersley, who is one of the two people from outside IOE to be contributing, has an interestingly, challengingly critical view of Karl Mannheim, who has given his name to one of the chairs at IOE, associating him with Jean Floud and suggesting that there may be actually a false start for the sociology of education in Britain. And Namrata Sharma writes about Jagdish Gundara and the field of intercultural studies. The next group of papers I've grouped under semiotics, linguistics, and policy sociology. Elisabetta Adami, Sofia Diamantopoulou, and Philip Victor Lim write on Gunter Kress and his social semiotics. Ahmed Jabbar Ben Swait with Miguel Perez Milans draw on the inspiration of the late Jan Blommert on pressing times, losing voice, critique, and transformative spaces. And Michael Apple, a former world scholar at IOE, writes about the experience of being at IOE, and in many ways it's a tribute to Jeff Whitty. And the fourth section, addressing policy, Sandy Oliver, who's here, has written on Anne Oakley. Her paper will be published tomorrow, in fact. And Claire Goodley and Jane Perriman, Jane is here, have written about the influence of Stephen Ball on their work and the way they've addressed the terrors of performativity. And John Morgan has written about IOE's still active Michael Young and the curriculum in Britain. And the final section that I've chosen is decolonisation. Georgina Brewis and Kathleen Hannam, in a paper that will be published in about a week's time, talk about their course, The Worlds of UCL, teaching and learning institutional but also colonial histories. If you want to read any of these papers, and I highly recommend all of the papers, there are posters around the room with a QR code on it, and it takes you straight to the special feature. They're all open access, of course, as is all the work of London Review of Education. But finally, we come on to the paper by Elaine Unterhalter and Leila Kadiwal that we've chosen to feature this evening, and it's on education decolonisation and international development. And I'm very happy now to hand over to Elaine to start her presentation about this paper.
It's great to be able to present the paper Leila and I wrote to all of you, and thank you very much, Hugh and Li Wei, for the invitation to do so. I think we feel very proud to be chosen to be featured in this presentation of the special issue, which examines and critically celebrates so many facets and nuances of IOE's past, present, and future. And I want to say this with it's no more than a formal gesture of thanks, because I think it's a very important gesture towards the future to have for the theme of tonight, decolonization. So a big thank you to Hugh for selecting us, and to everybody who's worked to make this event happen. The subject of decolonization in higher education is simultaneously important, difficult, sensitive, and polarizing. Thinking about decolonization augments the complexities of reflecting on our spaces of academic work, which is always a difficult task. For me, this space is rooted in education and international development as a field of inquiry, and IOE as an institution, and I've worked at both for more than 30 years, and this kind of opportunity writing the article gave to think about that was a very profound moment to think about different decolonizing initiatives as they came and went, and the ups and downs of them. Leila and I open our article in the special issue on the history of education and international development at IOE by counterposing two events. In 1952, a formal lecture was given by Sir Christopher Cox. He was an educational advisor to the Colonial Office, and the lecture took place in the Beveridge Hall of Senate House. It's a very grand building and setting if you don't know it. This was part of a series organized to mark the Golden Jubilee anniversary of the founding of IOE in 1902. And Cox's talk celebrated what he noticed as the increasing importance of the Institute's involvement with colonial education. And he talked about this as a process of guiding, and this is a quote, guiding and helping colonial peoples to stand on their own feet. The phrase has a shocking ring today. In our article, we contrast this formal presentation with all its assumptions of superiority and adulation of colonialism, delivered with the Secretary of State for Colonies in the chair, with a decolonial cafe, which took place in 2022. And this event was organized by a group of early career researchers and doctoral students working in our center, the Center for Education and International Development, SEED. They came from many different backgrounds. They were all women, with none close to any government. In the Decolonial Cafe, they raised questions about the work we were doing, the relationships we formed, and the ideas and practices we used. The juxtaposition in the LRE article sets up a journey from the past, with a very explicit engagement with British colonial policy and practice was promoted, to a present which calls that into question, worries about the ways in which colonial hierarchies, exclusions, and injustices have persisted, the many forms these take, and the very real dangers to all of us living in a finite world where approaches to education need to be reimagined in the shadow of the climate crisis and the gross spread of misinformation. One thing about the journey to decolonization is that it is about a change from certainties to doubts, and from clear categories to complexity, and the puzzle of how to hold together rigorous approaches to analysis and values of care, collaboration, and compassion. However, this is a journey where one constant is probably disputes about the past, how it should be depicted, investigated, evaluated, and responded to. I'm only going to give you a taste of some of that process in the history of education and international development at IOE that we've investigated this far. On this slide You can see the different names and organizational forms of the departments concerned with colonial education that Cox had celebrated and the Seed Collective worried about. Names like the Colonial Department, Education in Tropical Areas or Developing Countries are powerful placeholders. The history we have begun to outline in the LRE article signals both engagements and disputes with the colonial directions implied by those names. In each generation, I think there were students and academics who took a mainstream and a critical position. There is much to be done to distill those threads and identify who took what stance and why, and what might connect them, and the article only just begins to do that. What we do in the article is discuss 3 threads of approaches to decolonization. Firstly, we see a thread about decolonization that we associate with education in different places. Initially in the work at IOE from about the mid-1970s, this approach to decolonization was about studying and supporting the education systems and experiences of post-colonial states that emerged out of British, French, and Portuguese empires. This work later expanded to take in learning and teaching processes in low and middle income countries, many of which had different kinds of relationships with high income countries, which were not formally colonial, but were generally tied into relationships of production and exchange marked by inequalities. Some of the different places studied were also the new international organizations established after World War II, the UN family, and many global NGOs. These places of decolonization edged out the Christian mission organizations that had been linked with the establishment of the colonial departments at IO in 1927. This idea that decolonization in education is about building education systems in low and middle income countries remains the mainstream idea. In some of my lectures to our current cohort of students, I tend to characterize this approach as a search for what works. How can education systems be made to work? A second thread around decolonization, which we distill in the article, is accounts of work done at IOE in think about decolonization as deploying ideas. So decolonization is about thinking, or reimaginings, I guess, and the policies and practices that follow from these, to critique inequality, racism, sexism, violence, many forms of poverty, and the construction of hierarchies. I have sometimes referred to this approach, which would characterize a lot of my own work and that of many colleagues at SEED, as what matters, as the ideas are implicitly or explicitly normative. This approach to decolonization requires different theorists, methods, networks, to the first form, but can sometimes work alongside the mainstream approach. So it's kind of decolonization of theory. And now I'm going to turn to Leila, who's going to talk about the third approach to decolonization, which comes out of some of the work in SEED, and a more radical questioning of processes and practices, and a more profound reflection on our positionality, privileges, and complicity in relationships of injustice. And I'll pass to you.
Thank you, Elaine. Hello, everyone. And thank you, Elaine, for taking us through a thought-provoking historical journey. I'll continue from where you left. First, let me invite everyone to participate in a short experiment. I'm going to say 5 statements, and any of these statements apply to you, please raise your hand. And I would be super grateful if you can participate in this experiment. Is that okay? Great. I see smiles and nods, so thank you. So the statement 1, my native language is valued in my field internationally. If it applies to you, please raise your hand. And keep it there. Please don't keep it down yet. I see people like me widely represented in reading list in my field. I can travel to most parts of the world to study or work without worrying that I'll experience hostility and challenges in obtaining a visa. If this applies to you, keep your hand up. If this doesn't apply, just put it down. I can work in my field without being seen as a diversity hire. I do not feel that my surname disadvantages me. Great. So if all these statements apply to you, please keep your hands high and just let's look around each other. Let's look in this room. Maybe the racialized hierarchy? Okay, thank you very much for your participation. We'll unpack this a little later. Thank you for participating. Now, I would like to add a caveat. As you can see, I can't stand still, but that's not the caveat. What I say today is very much shaped by my historical situatedness in the long historical journey that Elaine has outlined. So I do not claim to make a representative statement for SEED or IOE. Now, let's turn to decolonization. It's a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, heterogeneous, multi-generational, and contextual discourse. Generations of activists have contributed to developing the discourse of decolonization. So, my question today is, what is the broader context, contemporary context, that has led to a more radical rethinking and a greater surge of recent interest in decolonizing in the UK? Now, as you can see, some pictures here, these are from Rhodes Must Fall. And this movement coincided with the establishment of Center for Education and International Development in 2017. Now, an important movement, so this movement had already spread from late 2015 and 16. It's a controversial but influential student movement that swept across university campuses. Many students and staff at the University of Cape Town demanded that the statue of Cecil Rhodes be removed. Rhodes was a former prime minister of the Cape Colony. He was a mining magnate and an ardent imperialist. His mighty statues stood prominently on the campus, as you can see. The RMF movement was also echoed in the UK. For instance, Oxford, where Cecil Rhodes had endowed many buildings and scholarship. It also inspired Leopold Must Fall movement at Queen Mary University, Galton Must Fall at our very own UCL, a Gladstone Must Fall at the University of Liverpool, and similar initiatives. Student protest also led to initiatives such as Liberate My Degree, Why Isn't My Professor Black, Why Is My Curriculum White, to name a few. In 2017, Elaine, along with a Black student, Cecilia Salepe, and our colleague Colin Howell, all from South Africa, added the conversation around RMF to our core module on education and international development. And that moment was quite empowering for me. Thank you. Then in 2020, Black Lives Matter protests swept across the world on the back of the brutal murder of George Floyd. Following these protests, large sections of the UK education sector, international aid and development agencies began to demonstrate an interest in decolonizing. Even the House of Commons published a report last year, Racism in the Aid Sector. So what issues do these movements raise that have implication for us at IOE UCL? In short, these movements call for an end to all forms of racism that persist in educational institutions. It is not enough to say, I am not racist. Being an anti-racist requires a deep political commitment to examining the structures and norms that reproduce Eurocentric and racialized hegemonies. Decolonization is about unmasking the hegemonic power relations that colonize, oppress, violate people. It is about resisting extractive practices at the intersections of racism, gendered, sexist, ableist, and class impediments. These movements call for an end to the whitewashing of figures such as Galton or Rhodes and demand that we recognize them for the imperialists they were. They demand that we critically appraise our institutional histories as we are doing today. They critique the nature of the curriculum, whiteness of the canon, and dominance of Eurocentric thought. They also question the levels of representation and seniority of black staff. Take the statistics, for example. In 2016, there were only 110 black professors in UK higher education out of 18,425 professors, 0.6%. And of these, only 25 were black female professors. Further, a report by the UK Research and Innovation found that white researchers are nearly 59% more likely to receive funding than their ethnic minority counterparts. And ethnic minority women are even further disadvantaged. So, you see the raising of hands, the very rules of the games are rigged. These diverse movements also critically engage with the neoliberal commodification of higher education, the licensing, increasing use of short-term contracts, disproportionately affecting black and brown people. The outsourcing of security and cleaning services so that private companies and stakeholders make huge profits. Decolonial actors have also called out universities' link with militarization, academic extractivism, and recognizing our universities' contribution to climate pollution and global inequalities. In addition to these issues affecting everyone as educators and researchers, decolonial movements raise unique questions for education and international development. The size and scope of international development organizations based in the global north have increased dramatically over the last decade. While the structure of global north-based organizations are not monolithic, the Eurocentric logic of development continue to dominate in practice. So the fundamental question that it raises is how do we, for us in SEED, how do we as a collective relate to the global majority? And the way hegemonic notions of international development and education relate to global majority are rooted in this particular template, which is called white savior template. There is racialized assumption of which people need developing and who will do that development. So, secondly, this image shows the shiny side of modernity, right? Electricity, the school book, the prosperity, urbanization, the nice, quiet cultivation of land, the enlightened side, and the barbaric side, which is in the dark, right? So this vision of American progress produced by a white middle-class man, John Gast, in 1872, which was a very popular image among white settlers, what does it hide? It hides the darker side of modernity. Genocide of indigenous peoples, enslavement, forced sterilization, land confiscation, and settler colonialism. And the foundational Western social theories have been complicit in this kind of knowledge production. Civilizing mission. There is an issue with the white angelic figure from the enlightened side carries the school book to those who live in the darkness. The Western social theories that underpin mainstream international development assume that societies around the world are at different stages of development, and rich Western economies are experts who are going to help them. There is also mythical claim to neutrality, as if actors act as if racialized geographies of the world do not affect knowledge production. There is also epistemicide. There is often little engagement with critical knowledges, egalitarian visions, and theories and debates produced by those who are at the sharp end of receiving violence. So the question is, how should we relate to the global majority, if not in white savior way? The answer, so this is mainstream, but there are enough decolonial movements that are talking about no to that approaches. So the answer is, how should we relate to the global majority? The answer that echoes across decolonial movement is in solidarity. Given planetary ecological destruction, With billions of people struggling to survive and having to migrate, solidarity would mean more critical education geared towards global justice education beyond the mainstream format of international development that would center the ethics of global redistribution and reparation. It would mean a new grammar of development that addresses global capitalism, imperialism, patriarchy, racism, and other forms of structural violence in a geographically interconnected way, not as here is the rich West, which is outside our gaze. There is international development, which is mainly racialized other, right? So we need that interconnected understanding. As someone with global North power and privilege, the term I use from the recently released report of Gender and Development Network, as someone with global North power and privilege, solidarity would mean speaking up and not shying away from reversing the gaze on structures that are complicit in global structural harm. It would involve holding rich economies accountable for resource extraction and warmongering, and for past and present harm. It would also mean looking into our own privileges, locations, and histories in power relations and challenging hegemony, ethnocentrism, ahistoricism, depoliticization, self-congratulatory and self-serving attitude, uncomplicated solution, and paternalism. Decolonization, finally, decolonization entails a practice of sovereignty. I quote Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, it's a practice of sovereignty, is self-determination. It would mean that those who have been the objects of research are involved in setting of research agendas, not the elite donors. Solidarity would mean standing with marginalized communities in a sustained, reciprocal, an accountable way, and finding a way to amplify the egalitarian imagination, theories, and concepts arising from the most violated. So with those caveats in mind, with these huge inequalities that shape our world, we started some efforts, and Elaine Colleen Howell, Charlie Nisi, Lindsay Robinson, May Abimogli, and range of other colleagues have been involved in some of the decolonial collective. And I'm saying many of our colleagues are involved from SAID, but I'm just mentioning a few examples. And I'll end here. So there has been Decolonial Study Collective, blog series, student decolonial cafes, staff cafes. We also did one with Leong's support and Lee Wei's support with CCM. We also went to conferences, started reading groups. We are rethinking course materials and publications of works and the way we work with our research network. So there is a lot happening, and I'll end here. So this is where we are. When we know better, we will do even better. Thank you very much.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Elaine and Leila, for the invitation to respond to your paper. I'm quite excited because I found it challenging, mainly because I am South African and decoloniality takes a very particular shape in South Africa. Now, to think about decoloniality here in the global north is a very different project, right? And the implications for development and education are quite different. So thank you for the challenge, and challenge accepted. I hope I'll have a few meaningful things to say just now. So I thought that the paper raised some key tensions, right, around the fact that neither different groups nor those within those groups necessarily participate equally in the category of post-coloniality. So there was an interesting kind of nuance for me that was surfaced in the way that you wrote the paper and the kind of historical trajectory that you take. So to begin with, I'll say that obviously the article engages with the question of time to argue for the need to center specific, unequal, and power-laden relations to history, as well as memory across both the global north and south. Mm-hmm. And in so doing, I think it reflects on the modalities through which a narrative of history is constructed, because that's what I see in the paper, a construction of history. And a specific relationship between education and development is kind of naturalized over the course of this construction of memory and of history. So I'll make 3 very pithy points. I hope they're pithy, because I have 5 minutes. And here is my first point. It's related, again, to memory, but also to identity. I think that your paper, and Elaine, in your presentation, you touched on some of this when you outlined how the title of the department changed over the years. I think that the paper demonstrates shifts in knowing and in not knowing, or in remembering or not remembering. So one of the major themes around colonization and decolonization is the kind of amnesia associated with that, whether we want to think it's convenient or not. That's a contentious issue. So I think the paper foregrounds the meaning and the implications of shifting registers of self-identification among the members of staff in the department. It also shows some shifting assertions of colonial as well as post-colonial identities within the department, in the way that you describe the kind of teaching and research work that is being done by members of staff, and their level of criticality to how either colonial or not decolonial their work is in each historical moment. So together with tracing the work that is being done within the IOE among the members of staff, I think you illustrate through the different titles given to the department over the years something very specific to your audience. And for me, that specific thing is the kind of mnemonic activity or the language and the symbolism that that language imbues around how we think about collective memory, as well as how we collectively remember. So this brings me to my second point, which I'll make very quickly because I've got 2 minutes. I find theories related to feminist geographies very useful in terms of thinking about memory and how to bridge the gaps between the memory in the North and the South, if you will. Despite the fact that those 2 terms are quite problematic, those are the terms that I'm choosing to use, and you can gun me down in the Q&A, but that's fine. But I think feminist geographies provide us with a sense of the kind of scale that spotlights global, continental, regional, as well as national and local scales that help us to think about and crystallize the imaginary of memory across spaces. So under the colonial gaze, for instance, spaces are empty of people, of normative and cultural values, of epistemologies, etc. They're completely vacuous. In addition to that, perhaps under the colonial gaze, if spaces are not entirely empty, then they are partially constructed. And we see that in the language of underdevelopment or developing, right? So that kind of language lends itself to what can be described as aspatiality. And I think the treatment of the formerly colonially oppressed as vacuous or aspatial lends itself to this kind of framing of anti-pocness as absence. So, or rather anti-BIPOCness. The term BIPOC refers to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So that kind of narrative around absence, I think, enables the sort of epistemic violence which you touch on in your paper. And you say that it prevents the formation of, and you quote Little on this, prevents the formation of endogenous models of education. Because it's not the case that there is no knowledge within these contexts or no, no ideas, etc. Right? Yeah. So to finish my point, I just want to say, for me, the paper really kind of highlighted the fact that disremembering as a process of unlearning is not simple, number one, but also disremembering can occur in ways that are unethical as well as paradoxical, in the sense that they allow a kind of forgetting while at the same time we are remembering injustices, right? So that juxtaposition and that contradiction for me were quite pronounced in the paper. If I can finish very, very quickly, I'll turn to my third point, I suppose, and say that I found it especially interesting that you gave your own kind of positionality very early in the paper to kind of frame the paper and describe how you experience the IOE. And I found value in that. At the same time, I want to be a little more critical of how you approach positionality, because I think positionality is quite an unstable thing, and I wish that was fleshed out a little bit more in the paper. So racial, gendered, and other identities are no more stable than other identity markers. And I think it's evident, for instance, in the shifting ways in which we write terms like black. Sometimes we use a lowercase b, other times an uppercase b. So what exactly does that mean for our anti-colonial project and how we are processing our positionality? And many people in different periods have rejected certain identities wholesale, and now see the possibility of the reclamation of these identities as very freeing. So to close, I will say I thought this was an excellent paper. Your presentations were excellent. I'm really excited to have learned what I learned about UCL, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Hello, hi. My name is Sean Surendran. Just recently finished my PhD. Thank you. And I'm also very privileged to be a student member on the LRE board. And it's coming up to almost 3 years now. And in that period, I've learned a lot about the LRE. It's been a fantastic place to work and connect. So the London Review of Education journal, that is. And in that time, I've seen LRE really be an advocate of social justice in education and really promote a international reach. And in that time, in recent years, it's published 2 special features on the issue of decolonization, and one on higher education and one on the school curriculum. And I was fortunate enough to be one of the guest editors, working alongside Dr. Denise Miller of Greenwich University and Dr. Emma Towers at King's College. So it's a very diverse group in terms of higher education institutes. And together we published 12 papers. We didn't, we curated 12 papers, which includes our editorial. And putting these papers together was a challenge. The amount of questions that come in to what constitutes its inclusion or, unfortunately, exclusion. I mean, we have to make decisions, and they're not easy. And what's really interesting is some of those challenges, those hard decisions, I'm really glad to say were reflected in Elaine and Layla's historical analysis. I thought that it was a fascinating account of almost a century of the development of the concept of decolonization at the IOE, and I found that really useful. And I just want to draw on 3 ideas, maybe themes from the paper that I thought was relevant to us working on a special feature, and I think just to draw out some things to think about, challenges, maybe critical ideas. So there was firstly what we just heard earlier about unlearning and epistemic hierarchies. And in the paper, they say there's a need for unlearning, a journey together, and horizontally and dialogically as co-unlearners. Secondly, there's geopolitics, and in our collection, we saw issues of political polarization. And so in the paper, they say one of the most challenging ideas of decolonizing relates to our positionality. And so they say it's reflecting on our location in geopolitics of knowledge production. And then the third point I want to address is safe spaces, or the issues around inclusion and diversity. And in their paper, they say decolonization is concerned to make spaces for subjugated peoples to contribute transformative knowledge and to demand reparations and global political accountability for justice. And I don't disagree with any of those, just to put that on the table. What I want to do is just draw on an experience of mine running reading groups at the IOE. I recall when I was running a group, it was on Vygotsky, we were discussing it, and I drew on the philosophy of Vygotsky and German idealism, and I connected it to Indian philosophy. And it was immediately responded to, "You're taking it too far." And I said, "In what way is it too far? I mean, for me, it's part of academia." But then on another occasion, coming out of these sessions, someone came up to me and said, "Do you have to be brave to say the things you do?" And I was like, "I don't think I'm being brave." But for me, it really indicates that there's already an idea of what belongs in academia and what doesn't belong to academia. And for me, it should be a space for our thinking, for our ideas, whatever your background. So I think in our divided world, with a public and constant gaze from social media, and our papers really address, it was during lockdown, so many of the papers actually talked about these spaces that were not physical. And with that constant gaze, we got an indelible memory, which is a storehouse of our comments. And it serves as a constant threat to the very notion of freedom of expression, and where there's always the threat of retaliation, and it looms large. And I think there's a certain irony in the paper, I felt, that plays out. So we talk about solidarity, but I think there's also a sense of irony, which is quite current in our political discourse right now, which was when it talks about India and anti-Muslim genocide. And when we talk about these things, it's really important to bring in the different voices. And so I think this is a very active area. And so just in Parliament, they've been discussing, there's one side saying, this is happening in India. Then you got another side that's saying, well, we don't agree with that characterization. So I think these are contested issues, and they need to be engaged with, not just declared as a fact. And that, I think, is central to the political polarization, is when we talk about decolonization, can we really decolonize? Because there's a comment in the paper which says that we need to have a reset. But the question is, can we really reset? Or do we need to learn how to move on, the journeying together, so to speak? And so the idea of safe spaces or discussion concerns not only comfort or discomfort, trust or rapport, it also concerns issues of fear and the security relative to the communities we're from and we bring to these spaces. So in a world of Islamophobia and Hinduphobia and anti-Semitism and LGBTQ plus issues and sexism and cancel culture, the question is, can we have just debates in the real world? And the issue is, it's challenging. And the question is, how do we do that? We need more than a concept, because we need it in practice. And my own experience is that discussing it often excludes me, whether it's in the academic classroom or even with a group of students. It's not an easy issue, and we experience this selecting and deselecting issues for our collection. So I really want to just end with some ideas, is some open questions just to throw out there, is can decolonization issues be captured and presented by one or two or three academic authors? Or does it always need to be a collective in the day and age we're in? And can the classroom really provide a safe space for students, even researchers or academics for that matter? And so the question really remains whether educational institutes are able to provide such a safe space, and whether it can secure the safety outside those spaces, because we don't have these conversations in the four walls of the classroom anymore. And that's something we saw in the papers that were part of our collection, that these discourses are now distributed and they're more complex than ever. And so it's a challenge I faced and I continue to face. And I often don't feel that my voice is included in academic spaces, and often I feel excluded. And so I wonder whether the academic discourse and the philosophy and the epistemologies underpinning it need to be reviewed and discussed, because we're still working with a number of philosophies that's still situated in the West, where I feel my background is in philosophy and I don't feel represented in the conversations we have. So how do we continue the dialogue, or at least sustain it, without alienating and being inclusive? And that's an open question I leave to all of you. Thank you.
Is it enough to just try to create safe spaces either in the classroom, in school, or in workplace and elsewhere? Or should we be more radical than that? Is safe enough, a safe space enough? Anybody wants to respond to that?
Sorry, it's Li Fin. This is a theme I've been thinking about for a few months, the South Africans in the audience or in the room will pick up some of the nuance. South Africa often describes itself as colonialism as a special type, and that kind of exceptionalism is the way that many weird things happened in South Africa, reprehensible things. But in fact, it is connected with global processes and what has always been. And I think that we're at risk of thinking about education as education of a special type. Of course, it has its internal processes, which we need to understand and appreciate and detail and analyze, but it so connects with everything else. And I think that's been one of our missteps. And so safe spaces that are only in education without safe spaces everywhere else, where that's to me a problem, and I think we've got to work on that, and it's the kinds of connections that people have been suggesting that I think are important in relation to decolonization. Shall I pass this down?
Yes. Wants to add?
Yeah. Just to add my take, that what I've learned from working with activists from extremely marginalized backgrounds in India, because that's where my research specialization and situated experience is. And what they've taught us is safe space, safe enough for those who have been historically marginalized and have not been heard. So we need to secure the margin. At the same time, it should be a brave space so that those who tend to have come from more dominant castes or class backgrounds should be brave enough to embrace the discomfort. So there is a simultaneous play of safe and brave space, but Sundaran is right that it's probably not always possible, although in theory there is a hope for it, but in practice it can have a range of reactions.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if there is anybody in the audience wants to ask a question. Yes, please, go ahead.
Hello. Thank you, everyone. Elaine, still as sparkling as 2 decades ago when I was your student. Leila, it's delightful. Sean, it's good to see a student like me come and speak. And thank you, everyone, you and Li, for doing this and for the response. I think what worries me about some of the things that we talk about when we talk about decolonization is dichotomies. and definitions. And for me, the dichotomy worries me because I do feel an outsider here, but I do feel an outsider back home. We change. It's not one thing. It doesn't stay static. It's dynamic and it changes all the time, both in terms of identity, in terms of agency, and so on. So I think when we talk about decolonization, that needs to be put into the discourse and into the analysis. The other thing that I would like to talk about is that as time goes by, yes, there is change, positive change, but we are also seeing an accumulation of difficulties as well. So whereby in the past race maybe was the thing, now we are seeing, because of what's happening around, more things going into the difference and the colonial discourse, things to do with religion, things to do with other things, and the political, geopolitical aspect. And again, I'd like to see that complexity added into the uncertainty of the discourses that you're talking about. So all for it, and within CPA we are starting to talk about this as well. So I'm delighted that we can learn from EPS. But how would you see that reflected in your work?
Hello? Is it working? Yeah. I think I firstly want to just pick up on that first idea of dichotomy. And I think that's so important because I think it's relevant to the understanding of the nature and the culture of education in the West. Because there's so much emphasis on analysis, where what we have is we have this way of looking at knowledge by classifying things, this or that, black and white, east and west, and immediately the problem becomes, how do we deal with this dichotomy? And then what we do is we create another dichotomy to deal with it. And so we get these isms, and then it becomes this whole conversation about the isms. And I think this relates to that issue of religion, or whether it's science, faith and reason. And so we've got this kind of pendulum swing, whether it's Plato and Aristotle, or whether it's East and West. And I think along with analysis, what we need is maybe we need to look to the East to understand something else they do, which is synthesis. So when we study a flower, we don't split it open and then rip it to shreds. We study the flower as a whole, but also understand what it is in its part and how the whole is more than its parts. And I think that's a very important lesson because it gives us another way of thinking about epistemology or the nature of knowledge. And so this is a conversation I think is missing very often. Like I'll give you an example. One is death. So many times I've been in the classroom and they go, "Oh, death, it's a terrible thing. It's a very negative thing." And I'm just like, I don't think so. And so often I have to explain why I don't think death is a bad thing, because we don't see death in relation to birth. We see death and life as a cyclical process. And so there is this idea about how we need to think about different ways of thinking. So maybe we need a way of thinking about things in holistic ways, as well as, and so there's, just to finish off with an analogy, we've got this analogy from India I've heard, and I've learned, which is the scissor cuts and divides, like the mind. And the needle sews and joins together, like the heart. And the tailor needs to learn to use them both to make the garment. And I think this might be a useful lesson for education, that we bring all walks of life in the ways we think and speak and be.
Yes, please.
So, is this thing on?
Yes.
I like your response, and maybe I'll respond in a way that counters your response a little. Yeah, I completely agree with the idea of rethinking and doing so within the context of safe spaces, etc. But I think we also have to be critical of the tools that we adopt when rethinking. So I am a Black African woman, South African woman, who is very aware at the moment of how popular the Ubuntu framework is. So Ubuntu is this normative framework that suggests that our personhood is relational, it's embedded in our kind of collective way of being. I am because we are, which is nice. Except in practice, Ubuntu also requires us to consider who is allowed to sit at the table when we have certain conversations, whether they be around education, who is educated, and who is not. And the reality is that historically, it's been old black men who sit at the table and have discussions about who can go to school, why they should go to school, how long they should go to school, when they should stop going to school. And for me, I consider myself an Afrofeminist. I wouldn't say I'm necessarily versed in the theory of Afrofeminism, but I consider myself a black feminist from Africa. For me, it requires problematization before we step into the very utopian notion that safe spaces are easier or possible in contexts other than the North, in Southern contexts. So that's the one thing that I want to flag and to say that I think maybe it's not pronounced very much here, but decolonization is very hard, even in the South, because of things like this.
Very good point. Yeah.
Because of things like this.
Very important.
And that has to be foregrounded, even in thinking about the comment that you just raised just now, which I thought was brilliant. So
Thank you very much. Is there any question online? Anybody posted anything online?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, right. Let's take another question.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for all the presentations. My name is Gonzalo, PhD student from Chile, from Latin America. So I'm really glad to be here listening all the discussion about the colonization. I have two questions. So the first one is relating to the PhD structure and how can we decolonize all the requirements, all the guidelines that we have as a PhD student, for instance, when the first year you have to submit an upgrade with a very strict structure, and then you have to complete a thesis by your own lonely, when the colonizing is a very collective process, in my opinion. And the assessment is very colonial, in my opinion, and also is based on very hegemonic visions of what a thesis or what a PhD should be. So what kind of opportunities can you say about this kind of decolonizing the whole PhD and undergrad and all the theses in the different degrees? Secondly, my point is about how some institutions from the global north are using this decolonial approach to get more students and to get more profits, because for some people from Bolivia, Chile, and other indigenous communities in the south, we need to decolonize the decolonization process as well to avoid getting more profits and commodities from this kind of progressive way to promote a new kind of education. Thank you.
Can I pin you down? Sorry, put you on the spot. Is there anything you would like to say in response?
I think it's very hard to respond. I certainly take your point about the PhD, which is a very specific way of accrediting experience, accrediting skills, accrediting learning. I think that is something that we have to take up at an institutional level, and I think it is very helpful to have people who are experiencing that or have recently experiencing that feeding back to make suggestions of ways in which it can be slightly less intimidating and normative. Well, it's bound to be normative, I suppose, but slightly less intimidating and more creative as a process, I suppose. Certainly, I take the point about the ways in which institutions have drawn on students, rather privileged students, often from across the world. Obviously, that produces fee income that keeps the whole place going. And we need to find ways such as scholarships. IOE had, for instance, centenary scholarships that were able to enable other people who wouldn't normally be able to come to IOE to come. So that is also a very, very useful way of thinking. Sorry, your remarks are very useful to us to get us thinking about the way in which we recruit students, but also what happens with the students when we're here. And that's what this process of decolonization is about, is actually to make the IOE, as Sean says, more inclusive of all the people who come here.
And of course, the IOE is also leading the diversification of the whole doctoral system. We have the EdD, which is a very innovative system, of course, plus the professional doctorate, the doctorate in education psychology and other subject areas. If I may to put another colleague on the spot, Jane, as the faculty graduate tutor, is there anything you would like to say in response to that?
Well, thank you so much for that. I'm the faculty graduate tutor, which is why I'm being picked on this moment. I've listened to this whole debate with great interest and really agree with your points. I'm speaking as somebody without power and influence, and the IOE is very much now within the strictures governed by UCL. But I can certainly promise to act as an advocate, and perhaps we should look at getting some sort of working party together to think about some of these ideas in terms of, well, things like upgrades, etc., are in our power. So perhaps something can come of that.
Thank you very much. If we can take one more question, please. Yes.
Good afternoon, Peter Williams. I'm an old fossil because I was head of the Department of Education in Developing Countries 40 years ago. So I did know a lot of these people, like Cox and Elwin and Lewis and those who appear in the article. It's really a question, I mean, most of our interest, of course, is in the theme of colonialism and decolonization, but I was just wondering whether the authors several times in the article refer to the fact that they had only so much time to look at the past and there was a need for more research. I would plea to the Institute that it does see if it can find more money to look into the past, because sometimes in the article you get the impression that everything was different after 2016 or 17. I think you would be surprised if you looked at the reading lists in the 1970s and 80s, and if you talk to some of the students from that period, at the lack of hierarchy in the department as it then was, and at the wide range of materials that were looked at, I just sort of feel that it's been much more a period of continuity and change and evolution. I think not a sudden happening. So my question is whether you yourselves as the authors, and thank you very much for the thought-provoking article and your spirited talks today, but whether you yourselves see the possibility of more historical research, or whether the Institute itself has the resources with that. Because I think it's important. I don't think as it stands at the moment, as I read it, and I don't think either Elaine or Lila would claim, I don't think that is the history of the work of the Institute. It has a great deal to be proud of, and I think a lot of the thinking was being anticipated and has moved on. But congratulations on the piece you have done, and let me urge you to do more.
Thank you very much for that very fair comment. Of course, we do have an updated history of the IOE that Tom and Gary are both here, and it's also published as open access book by the UCL Press. But Elaine, is there anything you want to respond to? You want to say?
Thanks, Peter. I completely concur. I mean, I would love 2 or 3 or 4 doctoral students to go through what we know is a wealth of material in the IOE archives, in the carrying in the memories of people who've worked or studied. So yeah, there's a great deal to be said, and there's a great deal to be mulled over. Yes, to any funders who's listening, please fund this next phase of work.
Okay, we're already running about 10 minutes over time, so thank you very much for your contributions. Really, really appreciate that. May I invite Lin An, our Pro-Director for Research, to say a few words as a conclusion.
So I'd like to close the program with some remarks on the importance that the IOE and we as a research community attach to research and, importantly, open science in our current global issues. As we have all seen this evening, as well as research cultures that support diversity and inclusion. Now, all of activity, I'm very proud to say, is driven by a mission to further social justice. But more than just that, it's about social equity and to improve the lives of children and families. And underneath it all, at the bottom line, academic rigor is always pivotal to that. But ever more so, I think, are the principles of equity and inclusion, and of course that ethos of ethics and integrity that's absolutely at the heart of what we do. But what does that agenda really mean for us in practice for our research, and what levers as well as responsibilities that we should ask ourselves as an organization, but also as researchers? And I think firstly, our responsibilities to support that really strong tradition of engaged and participatory research, and in particular, that principle of inclusiveness, so that underrepresented groups are included in research, in projects, in a meaningful, I should say, an authentic way that might otherwise be seen as perpetuation of that colonial discourse. And of course, alongside this, our research strategy that looks at who our researchers are and the support that they receive to grow and progress into research leaders. And that's very much at the heart of what I do in my role. Now, secondly, I think it's about also capacity building for our researchers. For instance, in terms of enhancing research development for our communities, and also thinking about, and always think about new ways and opportunities to hear from our stakeholders, which is really important. And of course, the London Review of Education is free to read and freely accessible, importantly, free to publish in, which is not always the case. And thirdly, I think the importance of paying ever greater attention to our own research and institutional partnerships in the spirit of decolonization. So at the Institute of Education and with the London Review of Education, I'm really proud and energized by this broad agenda that we've sketched out today. But this is only the start. And as we have discussed this evening, these are complex, challenging, and also uncomfortable matters that comprise multiple journeys and absolutely requires ongoing dialogue. Now, there's a lot of discussion today about positionality. So I speak from my own position as a post-colonial child. We cannot erase the past, and that colonial relationships that we've heard, so entrenched in history, have not just disappeared, and we cannot change the past. However, we can change the future by giving voice and presence, as we have here, to the decolonizing narratives that we work and continue to work to shape, in order that we may have those better analytical tools to support more sophisticated critical thinking about education, but also about wider issues around social equity and inequalities. And as the discussion today has shown, it is about raising those important questions for reimagining education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and thanks very much to the contributors, speakers today, all the contributors to this special issue, and of course the reviewers and our press. Very, very grateful to your support and everything. Please do read all the articles. They're absolutely fascinating accounts. And again, thank you very much for all the contribution. Thank you to the audience for being here. To those who are joining us online, this, I'm afraid, is a goodbye to you. Hope you have a good evening. And those in the room, please continue the conversations. I know lots of you did have questions to ask. Please continue with that over a drink. Thank you.